All right, so this is our last session in Mark. We're thinking about Mark's Passion. And it's up to you how you engage this. I'm going to work my way through the notes. Okay, so if you want to have the notes in front of you, that's fine. Because you have the notes whether you're looking at them or not, I'm not going to give you every reference because that gets quite tedious. But equally, if you'd rather have your Bible, I'll give some references and you can sort of use the Bible knowing that the notes exist. Okay, and probably at one point we'll look at a section in twos for 5 minutes, but it's not going to be as much of that, if that's okay. All right, so we're going to think about the Passion in kind of several categories. We're going to think about how it's prefigured, how it's kind of being hinted at early, then how it's predicted, which we've just talked about, but we'll just go over that again briefly, and then how it's portrayed in that final section. Just kind of walk our way through that. Obviously, that's quite a number of chapters, so we're not going to read our way through that, but we'll kind of try to think of how it's flowing a little bit. And then finally, we'll get to the sort of, if you like, what did I call it? The significance, sort of the biblical theology of Mark, if you like. What's he doing as he presents the Passion? Okay, now obviously, I always feel like when we get to the Passion in the Gospels, we're standing on holy ground. And it feels almost wrong to not just read it and sit. But with your permission, we're going to talk about it because, that it just feels like we probably should in this environment. But certainly in the past, we've at Cor Deo, we've done what we call Bible feasts, where we take the standard rhythm of Cor Deo is we start the day with Bible. And so we start with a passage, whatever we're doing, whatever study program we're doing, start with a passage, scribbling on it, observation, what do you see, who's in it, go through all that, understanding it. We want to hear from God first before we talk about him. So we always start with Bible, and then we move on and think about history and theology and sort of the application of all of that. That's the rhythm we are in the courses that I do outside of here. But sometimes we do a Bible feast where we say, actually, we're not leaving the Bible at all. We're going to do a whole book. So we did the Gospel of John in 4 days. And I cannot think of anything that was more like being in heaven. And we didn't sing, we weren't in an international crowd, all the standard things that get heaven references. It was just soaking in the Bible. And so we marked up, we storied, we did different things with it, but we worked our way through the whole text. We did it again with Hebrews over 4 days. And it was priceless. It was so good. But what we find is when we're doing a 4-day through a Bible book like John, you kind of get creative so that every session isn't the same. But when you get to the Passion, just read it. Just read it and soak in it and just let it minister to your heart. Do you know what I mean? Rather than having a PowerPoint or something. So I'm sort of breaking that because I'm going through notes, but I just want to kind of underline that as preachers, maybe there's a multitude of ways of preaching the cross, but when you're actually preaching the narrative that is in the text, actually simple is not bad. But sort of a plain approach can really kind of underline the seriousness and the significance of it. So even thinking within a series, how can I avoid just doing the same thing and replacing it with new content every week? One way would be to sort of mark the fact that this is holy ground we're on. You see what I mean? So let's work our way through this then. So the Passion is not, as we know, a surprise in chapter 15. But it's also not brand new in chapter 8, verse 34, where we were in the last section, because it's prefigured before that. Just as for the reader, from verse 1 that this Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, you're in the know, and Mark knows that you know where it's going. And so he's able to drop elements in, such as at the baptism. Jesus is referred to as God's beloved Son. And at the Transfiguration, he's referred to as God's beloved Son. Beloved Son. Could that be a Genesis 22 kind of allusion? Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. You know, that really emphatic moment in the call of Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. That beloved son language seems to sort of float in the background sometimes in the New Testament. And it's also in Mark 12, parable of the tenants as well. So actually those are three really significant moments. The baptism, voice from heaven, the transfiguration, voice from heaven, and the parable of the tenants, it's voice from heaven, but being quoted, isn't it? We'll see that maybe when we get to it. So when Jesus is taken away, then his followers will fast in chapter 2. So there's a hint. That's more than a hint. When he's taken away, we know what that is. They haven't got a clue. All right? What does the fasting suggest? Is fasting probably mourning? Grief and mourning and so on. So if it's grief and mourning, is it a very, very vague connection to Isaiah 53? You know, that his life will be taken away from the earth. I wouldn't want to overstate things like that, and I certainly wouldn't necessarily preach them, because people start to think, how could you possibly, you're just making this up, and then they'll start making stuff up. So there's some levels of allusion that you just keep it on the surface. Don't go, I wonder if, but it's good for us to be aware of. The Jewish leaders discussed Jesus in chapter 3, specifically how to, do you remember? Destroy him. That's kind of major. Judas's betrayal is mentioned in chapter 3, verse 19, and John the Baptist's violent death. That's kind of a bit of a shock as you're reading through. I don't know how much if anything was said about that yesterday, but it's quite a shock to the system. And John the Baptist is so associated with Jesus at the start, and then he's off the stage, and suddenly it's about John the Baptist, and it's shockingly violent. Is that preparing us for the greater one who's following him, shockingly violent death? If you have eyes to see, I think it is. Obviously, people in the story wouldn't, but with hindsight, I don't think we're reading into it to notice that kind of thing. I think the disciples, after they looked back, would have seen it in those kind of terms. That if John the Baptist is leading the way for Jesus, and then John the Baptist's death is violent, just like Jesus, I think that could have been coming through. I was just chatting with Lindsay a little bit in the break about the idea that Mark's gospel is Peter's gospel. I don't know how much we've said that this week, but John Mark spent time with Paul and he spent time with Peter. Unique connection, I'm sure I said that. But I was just thinking about the fact that this is what's sort of generally presumed among evangelicals, if John Mark was with Peter in Rome at the end, either when Peter is imprisoned or when Peter has been executed, there would be an expectation or pressure from the church community. Write down the stuff that Peter was talking about. You know him better than us. You heard it more than us. Please. There's a sort of a sense where that would make sense. And just thinking about, for a poor analogy, Tim Keller's just passed away. For some people, Tim Keller was huge. Not at the level of Peter for the church in Rome, but genuine mentor figure, genuine blessing from God for some people. Like maybe they got saved under him, shaped by his books and his thinking and his approach to ministry. Clearly, the guy is respected. If somebody were to write what Tim Keller was saying, it wouldn't be a sort of dispassionate summary, there you go. If it was the person closest, or one person close, they would want to not just reflect what he said, but how he said it. Do you know what I mean? And George Verwer, I was close to, or was significant in my life in OM, and he just died last month. And so if I were to kind of write and talk about George Verwer's ministry, I wouldn't do it my style. I'd end up reflecting some of his style and some of his passion and some of his figures of speech and stuff. And I feel like we've got that with Mark. Mark writing Peter's gospel, How did Peter preach? Probably lots of ands and lots of immediatelys and lots of energy and lots of drive. And it's probably much more Peter's gospel than just, the bits that Mark didn't know, Peter told him and Mark put it in his own style. I think Mark, in his own way, did it in Peter's style. Yeah, so passion prefigured, then the passion predicted. So we've covered this ground, but maybe it's kind of helpful to see the three predictions specifically. Let me read them out and just kind of give you the titles. So, first prediction, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed and after 3 days rise again. So we've got the necessity of his death. He must suffer and be killed. We've got the antagonists, the elders, chief priests and scribes. And we've got the mechanism, be killed, 8:34, the cross. So in the immediate follow-up, he says, take up your cross and follow me. Implication, I'm going to the cross. So we've got necessity, antagonist, and mechanism, for want of better labels. Second prediction, Mark 9:31, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days he will rise. So in the first one, you've got the necessity. He must suffer. This time there's this sort of passiveness of it. That feels like it should be in quotes. But he's going to be delivered. It's going to be done to him. All right? You've got the antagonists, this time the hands of men, so more general, and the timing of the resurrection. After 3 days he will rise. So it's equally brief, with some overlap, but a couple of different details. So it's developing. It's not straight repetition. And then the third one, 10:33-34, see, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. That feels substantial, doesn't it? It's sort of end stress, if you want to put it that way, that this prediction is being established, but here's the full one. And often you in this kind of thing, you might see that the other way, where you get the full one and then just a little flashback, such as different type of literature, but Ephesians 1, to the praise of the glory of his grace, to the praise of his glory, to the praise of his glory. I don't think it's forgotten grace, it's shortened because it's been established. But here it's building towards, because there's a revealing going on. And so what have we got? Location, going to Jerusalem. Again, the passive thing, be delivered. Antagonists, the chief priests and scribes. The legal nature, condemn him to death. So it's not he's going to be assassinated or he's going to be, the victim of a crime. They're going to view it as a legal killing. The Gentile involvement, he'll be delivered over to the Gentiles. Some details in the suffering, and Lindsay brought this out, mock him, spit on him, flog him, kill him. And then the timing of the resurrection, after 3 days he will rise. So in terms of a number of details, there's three, and then there's 7. So you're going to see how that's working. Okay, so should we look at the kind of the portrayal, walk through it a little bit, and feel free to chip in, because I am clearly not going to say everything that should be said or could be said, but we just want to sort of get a feel for Mark's handling of that final week. As we do this, or before we do this, I think this is where we've got to be clear in our minds what we're doing with the fact we have 4 Gospels. Okay, more than probably anywhere else in the Bible. In fact, the only other place you have 4 accounts of the same thing is the feeding of the 5,000. All right, but then there's the same thing would apply there. Our tendency is to harmonize and preach the event. Okay, and I think we should harmonize as a step in the process. Right, so when I say harmonize, what I mean is put the pieces together and create an understanding of what actually happened that week. So, you get the charts, what happened on the Monday, what happened on the Tuesday, what happened Thursday evening, and then late Thursday evening and early Friday, and you're putting it together, the trials, you put them together. If you don't look at all 4 Gospels, it seems like there's maybe 2 trials in several of them. But when you put them together, you end up saying, no, actually there's 6. And so the harmony helps you to know what's going on. And the temptation is to think, right, job done, I'm preaching that. And then you just preach the event wherever you are in the text. And I would say, no, as preachers, let's not do that. Let's be a bit more sophisticated. Let's do that first so that we don't make mistakes. But then let's preach the text we're preaching. Because these were not written as plain biographies. These were written as theologically sophisticated presentations of historical fact. Do you see what I mean? So Mark is trying to say something in the way he portrays the details. And John is trying to say something. And it would be a shame if we didn't hear Mark's something and John's something and Matthew's something and Luke's something, and we just heard this sort of historic something. It's not wrong for us to recognize and to help people know this literally, historically happened, but we're seeing it through the lens of one of the 4 Gospels. So you've got to know what the 4 do so you don't make a mistake in your presentation, but then it would also be a mistake to not then focus on what the one is doing. So, for example, you might be desperate to preach the "it is finished" of the cross, but you can't do it unless you're in John. It's a really significant moment. I don't believe "it is finished" is in the other 3, is it? And so, that there's different things emphasized. In the feeding of the 5,000, another simple example, you might make the mistake in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and John, of as you're describing and painting the scene, talking about, these crowd being told to sit down on the ground, and it was Middle East, and it's hot and it's dry, and they sat down, and Jesus provides food for them, and it's amazing. And then someone comes up to you and says, "Sorry, I got confused. I missed the introduction. I was reading Mark. It says the grass was green." That's weird. Mark's supposed to be the plain one. Why would he add a detail? Or why would he have a detail that the others drop, is a better way to put it. Sorry? Yeah. Because he's describing something. He's theologically driving something in terms of the shepherd, in terms of, it's either Psalm 23 or the eschatological feast. It's that kind of concept, which actually both are in Psalm 23. And so it's that sense of the richness and the verdant provision and so on. Matthew, Luke, and John don't disagree with that, but that's not what they're getting at. And so for them in their writing, mentioning the color of the grass is completely unnecessary. I always say papyrus was expensive, and so they're not going to put in silly detail. They're not going to put in extra details that don't help what they're trying to communicate. And so you can save a few letters, do it. And so that's why the Bible stories tend to be really succinct, but therefore every detail matters. And so you don't have to sort of wade through endless description of the guy walking into the bar wearing the tight jeans and the Levite belt. And you read modern fiction and you get pages and pages of pointlessness to set the scene. In the Bible, 2 men went to the temple to pray. Or, it's just boom, set straight in there, and then every detail counts. So from this point on, we're in there are 4 accounts of this territory. And so be aware of what happened, but preach the passage. Don't preach the historical event unless you're doing some specific thing that is what actually happened that week. That's fine too, but we're supposed to preach the Bible. Yeah? So, chapter 11, right at the beginning, when they drew near to Jerusalem. So this is he's been pointing to Jerusalem, now they're drawing near to Jerusalem. He comes, he cleanses the temple. So the triumphal entry, cleanses the temple. I love this. It's kind of anticlimactic, isn't it? He entered Jerusalem, went into the temple, and when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany. So I've arrived, big crowd, walks in, looks around, and then leaves. Okay, so that's That's that. And the following day, curses the fig tree, comes into the temple and cleanses it, comes out and talks about the fig tree. So that's sandwiching. Be thankful for sandwiching. It helps you to collect texts to shorten your series a little bit. And so lesson from the fig tree, and then the authority of Jesus challenged. That tension and conflict that's been there from chapter 3 is still there now, and Mark's making sure we see that. But we're told that the authorities are afraid to arrest Jesus because of the crowds. So there's this tension now that Jesus has arrived in Jerusalem and the crowds are celebrating, and the authorities are still as mad at Jesus as ever, but there's this fear element of we can't arrest him because of them. And then you get the parable of the tenants. And I think this is important, not just because of what it says, but because of the location where it sits. You'd sort of expect, if you're coming, say, from Luke or something, you would probably expect parables. Oh, yeah, that's the Jesus ministry setup stuff. We've had Mark 4, the parables there. Maybe it should have been back there. Or, if we're thinking of Mark in the structure of 2 blocks of teaching kind of right in the middle of the 2 halves, Mark 4, Mark 13. Well, maybe it should be that. No, it's on its own, but it's in the setting of Jesus in Jerusalem with the tension with the authorities. And I think the parable of the tenants is strikingly clear. And I think they felt it. The servants being sent, they took the servants and beat them, sent them away. They killed another. And so there's this kind of continual rejection. He had still one other, a beloved son. That's quite a key phrase, in terms of baptism, transfiguration. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But those tenants said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." And they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. And what will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read in the scripture, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. And they were seeking to arrest him, but feared the people, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them, so they left him and went away. That's very different, isn't it, than the kind of confusion or the lack of understanding. Like, they get it. They know he's going at them. And you sort of feel like, wow, this is intense now. I mentioned the Mark drama the other day. I have so many memories of doing that and being in that, but one of the things that is so clear is that the turning point in 8 is the turning point in the feel of the whole story. The first half, it's exciting, it's energetic. I think people that are experiencing Mark 1 to 8 are kind of like, whoa, what's going on? And there's fun and there's jokes and there's serious bits and there's tension and it's, it kind of gets the heart pumping. But then from the middle of 8 onwards, you can hear a pin drop. It's just silent. And it's this intense, heavy kind of, it's not funny now. There's a funny story in it, but it's kind of 45 minutes of intensity. And I think the parable of the tenants is one of those moments. You feel it as it's presented in the drama. Like, no one can miss that. It's really, really strong. So then the authorities, because of that tension, attempt to trap Jesus, but fail. So he navigates the traps. This is middle of 12 through to the end of 13. He navigates the traps set by the Pharisees, the Sadducees, a scribe. And then you get to 12:34, and it says, they asked, after that, no one dared to ask him any more questions. So he's achieved, I suppose, victory. They're trying to trap him. They're failing. And they're failing so much that we're given that kind of summary statement. After that, no more traps, no more attempts, no more questions. Wow, he's wiping the floor with us. one after another coming with their questions. It's almost got a American wrestling vibe to it. And then he teaches in the temple, end of 12, and then about the temple, chapter 13. So it's geographically, we're very much centered there. Coming to chapter 14, the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Again, that's introduced. Start of 14, it was now 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him, for they said, not during the feast, for there will be uproar from the people. And so there's this kind of intriguing thing going on. They've tried the public, that failed, now they're going private, but they're not backing off from their agenda. They're going to get him, and that's their view, right? We'll do whatever it takes, but we've got to do it carefully. Now just be aware of the context of that. This is true at this point, but it's also true throughout the Gospels. When it says things like they were seeking to kill Jesus but could not, it's not that they were trying to plot a murder and couldn't come up with a way to do it. I don't want to be morbid, but it's not that hard to kill someone. You drive over them with your car, or you poison them, or you stab them in the dark, or whatever. Like there's a million ways to come up with a killing. They weren't trying to come up with a killing. They were trying to come up with a way to do it legally with their authority without the crowds getting upset, especially now it's in Jerusalem during a feast, because if the crowds get upset, John really gives us that background, the authorities will take away our place. They'll take away our power. Because for the Roman perspective, there's a 4-letter swear word, riot. R-I-O-T, and they'll crush. And so the authorities are doing everything, and their whole focus is kill Jesus, except for the fact that if we create a riot, we lose our power, and we're not going to do that, obviously, so we've got to be stealthy. So that's the kind of background of what's going on there. We don't want any uproar from the people, because we lose our jobs. We lose our position. And so then you get the anointing at Bethany, and Judas agreeing to betray Jesus. Interesting how those two come together. The money element, right? Judas went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them, and when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money, and he sought an opportunity to betray him. I've got a feeling that I know what the plan was, and it wasn't what happened. Right? That Judas's plan and their plan was, after the feast, once the crowds are leaving, I'll make sure he doesn't get away without you being able to find him in the melee, in the large crowd. And so that, I think, makes sense when suddenly things are kicked into gear and they're not ready. Because you think, well, if they've paid him and he said, I'll betray him, I'm looking for an opportunity, and then he comes to them and says, okay, it needs to be now, guys. And then they seem to scramble, right? When they bring him to Pilate, they're not ready with an accusation. When they bring him before the Sanhedrin, they can't get two witnesses to agree. They seem to be completely in a loop, like what's going on? I think it's because it's 3 or 4 days before they were planning to do it, and they were surprised. Jesus then celebrates the Passover with the disciples, 14:12 and onwards. And what does he give as its significance? Obviously, it's his death. So that's in a sense, it's like the Passion predictions. This is a Passion explanation, isn't it? There's a real signification of what's happening as Jesus explains for them the significance of the Passover now, as opposed to what it was before. And so then, verse 26, when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Anyone know what the hymn was?
Psalms 116 something or what?
Keep going. Yeah, so the Psalms 113 to 118 were integrated into the Passover. And so 118 would have been the final one. So almost certainly this would have been Psalm 118, which put yourself in that room in your imagination and then read through Psalm 118. stone the builders rejected has become the capstone. This is the day that the Lord has made. I will rejoice and be glad in it. It's hard to read that. If you can turn your imagination on enough, it's hard to read that knowing what we know and imagine Jesus singing it without crying. I mean, it's just incredible. So that's probably the hymn. And so then they head out to the Mount of Olives. And Jesus says, you will all fall away. For it is written, I will strike the sheep, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. Peter said to him, you almost know what's coming, don't you? Jesus says something, this is kind of like chapter 8 again. Even though they all fall away, I will not. And Jesus said to him, truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he said emphatically, if I must die with you, I will not deny you. And they all said the same. Sometimes you just wish that you could go, don't talk. This is not going to go well. And so they get to Gethsemane, asks his disciples to sit while he prays, takes Peter, James, and John, begins to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful even to death. Remain here and watch. Going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed, if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. How do we know what he prayed? Hang on. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. And he came and found them sleeping and said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came the 3rd time and said to them, are you still sleeping, taking your rest? It is enough, the hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. So the hour has come. Sounds like John, but no, it's Mark that's doing it. He's been predicting this. Here it is, betrayal. It's happening right now. Immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas and the crowd came. And they had the signal and the kiss and all of that. They all left him and fled. Just like Jesus said, strike the sheep and the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. And the young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. If that's not John Mark, I'm confused. And if that is John Mark, maybe that's how we know what Jesus said when he was praying. That's kind of an amazing thought, isn't it? And a very human thought. As a teenage boy, 2 trees over, listening in, going, this is huge. And so then they bring Jesus to trial. And I think it'd be good to do for just a few moments. Maybe if you could, maybe we split you into 2 halves, but either work in 2 or work on your own, doesn't matter. Just going to take a few minutes. So this side, so everyone towards the camera side, have a look at Mark, I'll stop saying John. Mark 14:53 down to 65. So it's that section in the Bible. So it's Jesus before the Jewish authorities. And then this side, towards the flip charts, Mark 15, verse 1 down to 15. And specifically, so you've got the Jewish trial and you've got the Roman trial. That's the way Mark is breaking them down. And specifically, what I'd love you to look for, one thing, what is in this that is typically Mark? In light of everything that we've said about Mark's gospel, what do you notice? Don't worry about what you don't notice. Don't worry about what you know from John, Matthew, Luke. You're looking at Mark. What do you think could be, oh, that's so Mark, that is. Things we've seen before, ideas, concepts. See what you notice. In terms of comparing this account to the events, the kind of the harmonized understanding. As I mentioned, there's really 6 trials. We've got 2 here. Which 2 are they? So there's 3 Jewish ones. Annas, which I call the broom cupboard trial. It's not really a trial in a sense. It's like in the old police movies where someone gets brought into a place where they're not going to be seen and beaten a bit to get them to confess before putting them in another room to interview them. That's kind of the vibe with Annas. And then he comes before the Sanhedrin and Caiaphas at night. And then in the morning, they regather and he does speak. So it's another trial. First light. What they did at night probably wasn't legal. Got to ratify it when the sun's up. So as soon as the sun's up, 6 a.m., there's another trial with the Sanhedrin. This is covered here. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. That's actually a trial, that verse. But it's just being moved past. And so the religious trial is number 2 out of the 3. That's what Mark covers. He hints at number 3, but the focus is number 2. It's that Caiaphas Sanhedrin one, right? Then you've got 3 more, which you could call the Roman trials. They brought him to Pilate, but Luke tells us Pilate sent him to Herod, an out-of-town Herodian/Roman placed king authority. So he's sort of an awkward character. And that's a bit of a clown show. I mean, the way that's presented in Luke, you think, good grief, what's going on? Then he comes back to Pilate. So what we've got in everything except Luke is really a combination of 4 and 6. The Pilate trial presented as one, rather than both, separately. Luke helps you to see that they're separate. So that makes sense? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But no gospel gives you all 6. Why? Because it's not necessary. That would be a lot of explanation, But it does give you a lot, even with 2. It gives you sufficient to know what happened and to know this was unjust. And so the question then is, what is Mark doing in his presentation of the trials that reflects what Mark's doing in his gospel presentation of Jesus that might not be the emphasis you give if you're preaching Matthew, Luke, or John? They are quite distinct. Luke has got this inside information to Herod's court and all that kind of stuff because he was a good investigator. John gives you the Annas thing, but he doesn't mention, really, he doesn't give you the Caiaphas Sanhedrin trial. And after you've read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you think, well, one thing I know, the Sanhedrin trial matters. In John, he's like, skip that. Why? Because it's already established, not in Matthew, Mark, Luke so much as in his own gospel. Jesus has been on trial for 12 chapters or something. And so why reiterate the fact that they were determined to kill him? I think that's John's kind of drive, and then have much more on Pilate developed back and forth with the Jewish authorities heavily involved so that you see both aspects. You see how different they can be. So what's Mark doing? I suppose if we're going to be really simplistic, we could say the religious trial is kind of giving us this sense of Jesus as the king. He stands, he's quiet, they're chaotic, he's calm, a bit like John's presentation of this sort of dignified, regal figure. But when it comes down to it, when he's forced to give an answer, yes, I am the Son of the Blessed One. He kind of is quite a high statement, isn't it? The Daniel 7 thing. It's kingly, it's authoritative. Yes, he's not pleading, he's not begging, he's not upset, he's in charge. And so you've got that aspect, which I think we'll probably find in all 4 Gospels. But then you've got, if you took the Sanhedrin trial in Mark and added the Pilate trial in John, you'd have the dignified, quiet, sort of regal king in both trials. But the way Mark does it, I think he underlines the king, and then he gives us the silent sufferer. That he's not saying a thing. Led like a lamb to the slaughter, and a sheep before its shearers is silent. I think that really is a very Mark feel to the way he's presented the trials. Okay, then we get the crucifixion and the burial. So we're not going to go through that in detail, but the things I put in the notes here, Jesus' saving power is mocked by all. So there's a mockery that's going on. Just like he said in the third prediction, he'd be mocked and spit upon. All of that stuff is happening. There's the darkness that accompanies his death, as does the tearing of the temple curtain. That seems to be quite a sign. Who's it for? Is it a sign for the Romans, who are very superstitious? Is it a sign for the religious rulers? You can look at it and see how that's presented. And then kind of the key moment, if you like, in thinking in Mark terms, when the centurion, verse 39, who stood facing him, saw that in this way he breathed his last. That's very specific. It's not taking account of the whole thing, as a sort of vague general impression of the events of the day. No, it's when he saw the way he breathed his last, which for a Roman centurion he probably saw many, many times. And there was probably a real consistency, desperation, fear, agony, out of control, humiliation, all of the realities of the agonizing and just devastating way of killing. The Romans were killing machines, and the cross was as bad as they could make it. He'd seen it maybe hundreds of times, and he watches Jesus, and what a response. Saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly this man was the Son of God. Wow. That feels like a punchline to the book. That feels like, whoa, we've arrived. That's really a climactic moment. But it's not just before the Romans that he dies. There were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him, and there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. So this was witnessed by Romans and by his followers who were Jewish and women. Why does it emphasize the women? Because his followers have fled. His disciples, the official ones, are not there. And we know technically one was, but Mark's not emphasizing that. He's emphasizing the women, which is true. So this is where you see the potential sense of contradiction, isn't? You just got to work with, okay, is it fair to present it this way and for all of that to be true? Yes, it is. We don't have to give up historicity to affirm literary sophistication. This is not a battle between fundamentalists and liberals or something. You can learn from the liberals, if you like, learn to recognize how beautifully, carefully written the scriptures are, that they're communicating something. Do they have an agenda? Of course they do. You try and show me writing that doesn't. So there's an absolute agenda coming through the way they're crafting their material, but does that mean it's not true? That's always their argument. That's too sophisticated. It couldn't be true. Because truth is so dull. I don't get the logic, but you know what I mean? It's sort of either or. And so then you get the evangelical or traditionally the fundamentalist response. Oh, dismiss all of that. No, it's just making a truth. It's just what's the truth in this? And you miss all the sophisticated artistry in it. I think we're blessed, in our generation to be in a position to be allowed to recognize both. And it's a beautiful, poignant presentation of both. So here we've got the Jewish and the Roman witnesses of the death following the Jewish and the Roman trials and so on. And then we've got, within that we've got the Old Testament being quoted over these chapters. In chapter 12, he quotes Psalm 118. That's during the parable of the tenants. In chapter 14, he quotes Zechariah 13 to explain his death. And Mark is also leaning on Psalm 22 to describe the sufferer all the way through this. So there's kind of currents of Old Testament material going through. And almost to, I think, make sure we see how significant the cross is, the resurrection just kind of, it's significant. Don't misquote me, please be careful what you tweet. But the way Mark presents it, the resurrection is hinted at. It's left almost open-ended. Now, we don't know if there's a longer ending that was lost or if he was being really sophisticated in his literature. That could be a bit of an anachronistic way of reading things. But the fact is, what we are left with by God's providence is quite a kind of ... ending. So I don't think it's necessarily right to credit Mark with a sort of contemporary sophistication. But equally, it's not right to just dismiss the possibility. He's shown literary sophistication all the way through, so I don't see why he couldn't do that. But even if he didn't, God hasn't given us the ending. So, ultimately we trust God. So what we're left with is women go to the tomb where a man, that is an angel, announces Jesus has risen and is not here. And so the women flee, astonished and fearful. The end. Luke 15 ends like that. The older son, we're not told his response to the father. So there's multiple examples of narratives, but I suppose for a document of this magnitude, it does feel quite striking. I would say that I wouldn't preach 9 to the end. I think it's worth looking into that for yourself so that you can explain why, because it's confusing, because people have it in their Bibles and then they think, well, why are you not preaching it? So you've got to explain that at some point. You might come to a different opinion, but it's really a textual critical issue. The other big chunk is John 8 or John 7:53 to 8:11. I would preach that. I think that's genuine. It's just a question of where to put it in John. That's the debate, really. But this has got too much about it that is just different language, different ideas, maybe contradiction. So I personally, I wouldn't go there. Let me just run through the significance, final little bit. 3 things from the death of Jesus in Mark. Okay, so thinking about the whole book and what we've seen, 3 things. Number 1, Jesus' death brings atonement. That sounds like a statement of the obvious, but actually that's a statement of the Mark's theology. The atoning death of Jesus. I think this is kind of a hint of Paul's influence on Mark, if you like. The fact that he spent time with Paul, it almost sounds like Paul's epistles are creeping in to Mark. 2 key places. Mark 10:45, for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So he was paying for sin for others. And Mark 14:24, he said to them, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. So there's that substitutionary atoning, ransom paying. The atonement is there. And that seems like it, well, of course it is, but actually, no, it's very Mark. If you want to really preach the atonement, Mark's a great place to go. John presents the cross in slightly different terms, which is equally helpful, but different. And same with Matthew and Luke as well. So that's number 1. It brings atonement. Number 2, Jesus' death is a model. Okay, now let's not freak out that we're turning the death into Christus exemplar or something and denying the atonement. I've just told you the atonement's there. But it is a model for disciples to imitate. He literally told them that. When he started talking about the cross, he's talking about them picking up their cross and following him. Watch how I do it. He does it perfectly. And we're supposed to follow that. Okay, so that's really the second half of the book. And I suppose there's the negative counterpoint, if you like, in the disciples' failure in Gethsemane and ongoing. They fled, they denied him, they didn't follow. And so you get both the positive affirmation of it and you get the negative example of failure and therefore the implication of, will we follow? Will we take up our cross and follow? And so it's not wrong to present Jesus as a model in his suffering. Just remember that people's tendency will be to settle for that if they're not Christian. And go, you're right, that's such an inspiring story. Hang on, no, you've missed something. It's more personal than that. But it is that too. And then thirdly, Jesus' death points to both poles of his identity. I'm not sure if I agree with the wording, but the concept. His identity both as servant, slave of all, 10:44, is seen on the cross, like the lowest possible humiliating position. You get the suffering servant, Isaiah 53, but he's also king. And so Nobody calls Jesus king until Pilate does in Mark 15, verse 2, but then he is called king 6 times in 30 verses. And so Mark, if you've got a color, Lindsay gave us colored pens. If you've got a color for king, you're almost prepared to retire it. That's probably from the wrong gospel. And then you get to Mark 15, and suddenly that pen's getting used multiple times to circle the word king or whatever you're doing. You see what I mean? It's like, whoa. And so then when you look at the whole manuscript, king, 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 all around the cross. Okay, so it's Mark 15:2, Mark 15:9, Mark 15:12, so 3 times by Pilate, twice by mockers at the crucifixion, verse 18 and 32, and then once in the inscription, 15:26. So that's a cluster. When you get a cluster of a term repeated, don't miss it. Okay, and the best way to find that is to be getting into scribbling on the manuscript. Start pursuing that more. Okay, so Jesus' death brings atonement. Jesus' death is a model for his disciples to imitate, and Jesus' death reveals Jesus as suffering servant and as king. Okay, so I think that is as much of a summary as we're going to have time for.